ego that makes you compete even against yourself, Tesla explains. It was 1895. Nikola Tesla was alone in his New York laboratory when he realized something disturbing. He had spent the last 3 sleepless nights trying to prove that his new coil was superior to the one he had created 6 months earlier. There were no external rivals, no Edison to defeat, no investors pushing for results, just him against himself. And at that moment, as he held a piece of paper with calculations scribbled in despair, Tesla felt an icy shiver run up his spine. Something inside him was trying to destroy him, and that something wasn't a person. It was an invisible force, silent but deadly. He stopped. He let the paper fall to the floor, and for the first time in weeks he allowed himself to sit in absolute silence. It was then that he heard it, not with the ears, but with something deeper. An insistent inner voice that said, "This isn't enough. You can do better. You must do better." Tesla took a deep breath and whispered to himself, "That's not me. That was never me." That night changed everything, because Tesla realized that a genius's greatest enemy is not another genius. It is the distorted echo of your own voice, the one who is never satisfied, who always demands more, who turns each achievement into a new prison. He called it the ghost of the wandering frequency, a mental vibration that comes not from the universe but from the disoriented ego trying to compete with itself to the point of exhaustion. But what Tesla discovered that night went beyond any scientific theory. It was a brutal psychological truth. The ego doesn't need external enemies to destroy you. It creates imaginary competitions within your own mind until you lose sight of who you really are. Think for a moment. How many times have you felt frustrated because you weren't evolving fast enough? How many times have you compared today's version with tomorrow's idealized version and felt inferior? How many times have you looked at your own achievements and thought, "That's not enough. I should be further away"? If you've ever felt this, then you know exactly what Tesla was facing that night. And if this story is touching something inside you, subscribe to the channel, because what I'm going to reveal now will completely change the way you see success, failure, and the invisible trap that the ego builds to keep you trapped in a cycle of self-sabotage. Tesla spent the next few days observing something no one else could see. He began to map out the thought patterns that were leading to exhaustion. He wrote down every time he felt the need to get over himself. I timed how much time I spent thinking about what I had already done versus what I still needed to do. And what he discovered was chilling. The human mind, when dominated by the ego, creates 2 imaginary selves, the me that should be and the me that is never enough. And between these 2, the real person disappears. She becomes a ghost watching an eternal battle between 2 fictional versions of herself. Tesla noted in his diary, "The man who competes with himself never wins, because the opponent changes the rules with each victory." But there was something even darker about this discovery. Tesla realized that this internal competition was no accident. It was fueled by a specific frequency, a mental vibration based on fear, scarcity, and comparison. And the worst part, the more a person achieved, the stronger this frequency became. It was as if success, instead of bringing peace, activated a self-destruction mechanism programmed into the ego itself. He called it the spiral of never enough. And he began to realize that all the big names he knew, inventors, artists, scientists, were trapped in it. They were not competing with the world. They were competing with the shadow of themselves. And this shadow grew with each achievement until the person could no longer see their own light. Tesla then asked a question that would change everything. What if the ego was not my enemy, but just a frequency that I learned to tune into? Over the next few days, Tesla began doing something that his assistants found strange, even disturbing. He stopped working. It just stopped. Left projects half-finished, ignored letters from investors, canceled meetings, and he spent hours sitting in a chair in the center of the laboratory, eyes closed, just observing. Observing what happened inside his own mind when he wasn't creating, wasn't competing, wasn't proving anything to anyone. And it was there, in that self-imposed silence, that Tesla encountered the real antagonist. It wasn't a person. It was not an external circumstance. It was a voice he had carried for years without realizing it. A voice that sounded exactly like his, but wasn't his. She said things like, "If you stop now, they'll forget you. Another inventor will ish-igar before you. Your last inventions were better. What happened to you?" Tesla wrote everything down, and he noticed a frightening pattern. The voice never spoke in the present tense. She always spoke in the past or the future. I never said, "You're okay now." He always said, "You were better before," or "You need to be better later." It was as if the ego was terrified of the present moment, because in the present, there is no competition. There is only what is. And the ego does not know how to exist without comparison. But the darkest revelation came when Tesla did a radical experiment. He decided to spend an entire day without judging anything he did, without comparing, without measuring. Just act. He went into the lab, picked up tools, assembled circuits, tested ideas, but without the internal pressure to do better or prove something. And something extraordinary happened. He created in 4 hours what would normally take weeks, effortlessly, no tension, as if the very energy of the universe flowed through him when the ego was not in the way. But when night came, the voice returned, higher, more aggressive, and this time, she wasn't just criticizing, she was scared. Tesla realized that the ego wasn't just an internal tyrant, it was a desperate defense mechanism trying to protect something. But protect from what? He noted in his diary. The ego believes that if you stop competing, you will disappear. He doesn't understand that you can only truly exist when you stop competing. It was then that Tesla had a vision, not a mystical vision, but a technical, almost mathematical understanding of how the ego worked. He saw that the ego operates on a frequency of scarcity, the belief that there is never enough time, enough talent, enough recognition, and that this frequency creates a mental magnetic field that attracts exactly what you fear most: more scarcity, more competition, more insufficiency. Tesla realized he was dealing with a vicious electromagnetic cycle within human consciousness itself. The more you try to prove your worth, the more the ego convinces you that you are worthless. The more you achieve, the more it shows you what is still missing. It's a perpetual motion machine of suffering. But there was something Tesla still didn't understand. If the ego was so destructive, why did everyone carry it? Why hasn't human evolution eliminated this harmful frequency? That's when he found an old letter from a friend who had died years before, a poet who wrote something disturbing. The ego is not an error of nature. It's a tool we've learned to use wrong, like a knife in a child's hands. Tesla read it 3 times, and then he understood. The ego was not the enemy. The way he had been programmed by society, by culture, by external competition, that was the problem. The ego, in its essence, was just an identity sensor, a compass that should help a person orient themselves in the world. But at some point in human history, this compass was corrupted. She was taught to always point to more, better, superior, instead of simply pointing to true. And it was at that moment that Tesla realized something that chilled his blood. He was not fighting his own ego. He was fighting the ego of an entire civilization, implanted in him since he was a child. He got up from his chair, walked to the window, and looked out at the busy streets of New York. Thousands of people running, competing, comparing, never enough. And for the first time, Tesla felt neither anger nor frustration. He felt compassion, because everyone was trapped in the same trap. Everyone was competing with themselves without realizing that they were just repeating a mental program that was never theirs. But Tesla also knew something else. If one frequency was implanted, another frequency could be tuned. And that's when he started to come up with a plan. Not to destroy the ego, but to reprogram it, to change the frequency of competition to the frequency of creation, from scarcity to abundance, from fear to presence. He didn't know yet that this discovery would be the most dangerous of his life, because messing with the collective mental frequency meant challenging the very invisible structure that kept society functioning. And there were forces, seen and unseen, that didn't want anyone to learn how to get out of the competition. Because a humanity that does not compete with itself is a humanity that is impossible to control. Tesla began work in secret, not in a new physical invention, but in something he called the Neutral Frequency Protocol, a method for deprogramming the competitive ego and returning to the mind's natural frequency. He didn't tell anyone. He didn't write in newspapers, did not seek financing, because I knew that if anyone found out, they would try to stop it, or worse, they would try to turn it into another competition tool. He started by testing it on himself every morning. Before, from any thought about work or achievements, Tesla spent an hour in absolute silence. But it was not meditation in the spiritual sense. It was scientific observation. He wrote down every competitive thought that came his way, every impulse to do better, every voice that said, "You should be further away." And instead of fighting these thoughts, he simply observed them as if they were data from an experiment. And something started to happen. The voice became weaker, not because Tesla was silencing her, but because he stopped feeding her attention and belief. It was like turning off the electrical current in a circuit. Without power, the voice simply lost strength, and in the empty space it left, something completely different emerged. A stillness, a clarity, a feeling of being complete, exactly as I was at that moment. But Tesla knew that was not enough, because the competitive ego wasn't just a personal habit, it was a social system. The people around him continued to operate on the frequency of scarcity. They asked, "What's your next big invention? When are you going to surpass Edison for good? Why did you stop working so much?" And each question was an unconscious attempt to reactivate him on the old frequency. That's when Tesla realized something revolutionary. Society needs you to compete with yourself, because a man at peace with himself is not productive in the industrial sense. He doesn't work for validation. Do not consume out of insecurity. Don't compete for status. And this, Tesla understood, was dangerous for a system built on infinite competition. He began to observe other inventors, entrepreneurs, artists around him, and he saw the pattern repeating itself, all trapped in the never-enough spiral. Everyone exhausted, all brilliant but miserable, and everyone believing that if they stopped competing, they would cease to exist. Tesla noted, "The greatest trick of the collective ego has been to convince the individual that his existence depends on his performance." But there was an exception, an old scientist who Tesla met at a conference in Boston. The man was over 70 years old. He had made important discoveries decades ago, but now he lived a simple life, without rushing, without the need to prove anything. Tesla asked him, "How did you manage to get out of the race?" The old man smiled and replied something Tesla would never forget. "I didn't get out. I just realized I was never in it. The race was always an illusion." Tesla returned to New York with those words echoing in his mind, and that's when he had a risky idea. What if he stopped completely? What if he simply abandoned all the projects, all the expectations, all the promises he had made, and lived for a while as if he had already achieved everything he needed to achieve, not like giving up, but as an experiment, to see what would happen? And that's what he did. For 3 months, Tesla lived as if he were retired. "I walked the streets aimlessly. I read books that had nothing to do with science. I talked to ordinary people. And for the first time in years, I didn't think about the future. I didn't plan, didn't compete, not even with myself. At first, it was terrible. The voice of the ego screamed, 'You're wasting your life. People will forget you. You were once big. Now you're just an old man sitting in the park.' Tesla felt waves of panic, of emptiness, as if I were missing something essential. But he continued, 'Because I knew it wasn't real emptiness. It was just the ego in withdrawal, desperate for external validation.' And then, in the 8th week, something extraordinary happened. Tesla was sitting on a bench in Central Park watching children playing, when he felt a sensation he hadn't experienced since childhood. Happiness. Not the joy of achieving something, not the joy of being recognized, but the simple joy of being alive, aware, present, without needing to be anyone, without needing to prove anything. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath, and for the first time in decades, he heard true inner silence. There was no longer a competing voice. There were no more frequent shortages. There was just existence, pure, complete, enough. But when he opened his eyes, he saw something that made him shudder. A man on the other side of the park, dressed in an impeccable suit, was watching him. Tesla recognized the face. He was one of the greatest industrialists of the time, a man who controlled fortunes and influence. And he didn't look happy to see Tesla sitting there at peace. He looked worried, as if the presence of a genius at rest were a threat. The man approached, greeted Tesla politely, and then with a cold smile he said, "I heard you stopped working. What a shame. The world needs men like you in action, Tesla. Men who don't settle." There was something in his voice. It wasn't advice. It was a warning, an attempt to reactivate it on the old frequency. Tesla smiled back, but he didn't respond. And in that silence, the man understands. I thought something had changed, that Tesla had discovered something that should not be discovered, and that if this discovery spread, the invisible control structure based on eternal competition would collapse. The industrialist walked away. But before leaving, he looked back and said something that sounded like a threat disguised as a compliment. "I hope you haven't forgotten who you are, Tesla. It would be an irreparable loss." Tesla was left alone on the bench, and he realized he had crossed an invisible line. He was no longer just reprogramming his own ego. He was challenging the collective ego of an entire civilization, and that, he knew, had consequences. Because a system based on infinite competition does not tolerate the presence of those who have learned to live outside it. But Tesla also knew something else. He had found the frequency that dissolves the competitive ego, and now he needed to decide, keep it for himself or teach it to the world, knowing that it could destroy him. 2 weeks after the meeting in the park, Tesla received a letter. There was no sender, just an address and a date, a private meeting in a mansion in suburban New York. He thought about ignoring it, but something about that letter intrigued him. There was a handwritten sentence at the end. "We know what you discovered, and we want to understand why." Tesla was, not out of curiosity, but because he realized that if they really wanted to silence him, they wouldn't send an invitation. they would do it another way. He entered the mansion and was led to a luxurious room where 7 men were waiting, all industrialists, bankers, powerful figures of the time. And in the center, the man from the park. The group leader spoke first. His voice was controlled, almost friendly. "Mr. Tesla, we are admirers of your work, but we care about you. It seems that something has changed. You have stopped creating. You have stopped competing, and that leaves us confused." Tesla looked at each of them, and he immediately understood what was happening. Those men weren't worried about him. They were worried about what he represented. Because Tesla, at his core, was a symbol, and symbols have power. If the greatest inventor of the modern era simply stopped and lived in peace, without competing, without seeking more, what would that say to the millions who followed in his footsteps? What would this do to the structure of a society fueled by perpetual insufficiency? Tesla responded calmly, "I didn't stop creating. I just stopped competing with myself. And I discovered that without that competition, creation flows much more naturally." One of the men, the oldest, knocked on the table. "That's naive, Tesla. The world doesn't work like that. Progress comes from competition. If everyone thought like you, humanity would stagnate." And it was at that moment that Tesla did something unexpected. He smiled, not a smile of defiance, but of understanding. "Do you guys really believe that? Or do you just need everyone to believe that?" The silence was heavy. The men looked at each other, and then the leader of the group stood up, walked to the window and said, without looking at Tesla, "You are too smart not to understand how the world works. Humanity needs structure, hierarchy, competition. Without that, everything falls apart. And men like you, Tesla, have a responsibility to keep that structure standing, not to question it." Tesla stood up too, and for the first time in his life, he felt something he had never felt before: powerful men, compassion, because he realized that those men were not villains. They were prisoners of the same frequency he had just dissolved. The difference was that they had built entire empires on that frequency, and admitting that she was illusory would mean admitting that everything they built was empty. Tesla spoke, but his voice had no anger, just true. "You are afraid, not of me, but of what I discovered. Because if people learn that they don't need to compete to exist, you lose control, and control is all you have." The leader turned around sharply. There was fury in his eyes, but also something deeper: despair. "You don't understand, Tesla. It's not about control, it's about order. If every man decides he's enough, who's going to move the world? Who's going to build it? Who's going to fight?" And it was then that Tesla said something that changed everything. "What if I told you that the world never needed to be moved, that the fight was always against a figment of the mind, that humanity doesn't need competition to evolve, it needs consciousness?" The men were silent, and Tesla continued, "You have built fortunes, empires, legacies. But tell me, when was the last time you felt peace? When was the last time you woke up without the voice saying, 'It's not enough yet'? You win every day, but you never feel like a winner. Because the competition you perpetuate in the world is the same one that eats you up inside." It was like something broke in the room. One of the younger men lowered his head. Another looked away. The leader remained rigid, but Tesla saw something in his eyes: recognition, pain, true. Then Tesla did something no one expected. He walked to the door, but before he left, he turned and said, "You called me here to convince me to come back, to reactivate me on the old frequency. But I didn't come to be convinced. I came to offer you what I discovered. And the offer is simple. You can keep competing until your last breath, or you can learn the ego-dissolving frequency. The choice is yours." And left, without waiting for a response. No drama, just free. But what Tesla didn't know was that something was about to happen. Something that would prove that his discovery wasn't just theory. It was real, measurable, and powerful. Because that same night, as he walked home, Tesla felt a change in the air, as if an invisible frequency had changed. And when he arrived at the laboratory, he found something extraordinary. 3 of his assistants were working, but not in the usual way. They weren't competing for attention. They weren't trying to impress. They were simply creating, in silence, in flow. And when Tesla asked what had changed, one of them replied, "I don't know how to explain it, sir, but since you stopped pushing yourself so hard, something here has changed, as if the pressure had disappeared, and now we just create." Tesla felt a shiver, because he realized that the frequency was not just internal, it was contagious. When a person dissolves the competitive ego, they alter the energy field around them, and others, without realizing it, begin to resonate at that new frequency. It was exactly what he had theorized, but now he was seeing it happen. And it was at that moment that Tesla understood the real twist. He didn't need to convince anyone. I didn't need to fight the system. He just needed to live in the new frequency, and it would spread on its own. Because the truth, unlike lies, does not need to be imposed. It just resonates. and whoever is ready to listen, listens. But Tesla also knew it had a price, because living outside of competition, in a world that depends on it, is an act of silent rebellion, and not everyone can handle the pressure of being free while the world around them remains trapped. The question was, could Tesla do it? And more importantly, what would happen when others began to awaken to the same frequency? In the following months, something unexpected began to happen. Tesla has not spoken publicly about his discovery, didn't write articles, he didn't give lectures, but the change in him was visible, and people noticed. Assistants, colleagues, even strangers on the street commented, "Tesla seems different, lighter, more present," and this presence, this internal silence that he now carried, began to affect everyone around him in an inexplicable way. One of his assistants, a young man named Marcus who always felt inferior, began working without the usual anguish. He no longer tried to prove that he was as good as everyone else. He simply did his job, and he realized that, without the pressure of competing, he produced better, thought clearer, felt complete. Marcus came to Tesla one afternoon and asked, "What did you do? Because since you changed, I changed too, and I can't even explain how." Tesla smiled. "You didn't change because of me, Marcus. You changed because you stopped competing with the imaginary version of yourself that never existed." Marcus was silent, processing those words. And then he asked, "But what if I stop charging myself? Won't I stop evolving?" Tesla placed his hand on the boy's shoulder. Real evolution doesn't come from competition. It comes from curiosity, from joy, from presence. When you stop competing, you don't stop growing. You just grow without suffering. It spread, slowly, silently. Other people in the lab began to notice the difference. The atmosphere changed. Less tension, less comparison, more collaboration, and work paradoxically accelerated. Because when people aren't wasting energy competing with themselves, all that energy goes into creation, for the present, for what really matters. But the story didn't end there, because 3 months after the meeting at the mansion, Tesla received another letter. This time, signed. It belonged to the group leader, and he just said, "You were right. I've spent 60 years winning, and I've never felt like a winner. I need to understand what you discovered." Tesla did not immediately respond. He thought for days. Because I knew that teaching that to a man like that was risky. A man who has built an empire on competition could easily turn ego dissolution into yet another tool of control, another dominant strategy. But Tesla also realized something. If he denied knowledge out of fear, he would only be perpetuating the same frequency of scarcity, Z, that had dissolved. So he accepted. They met again. But this time, not in the mansion. Tesla asked to meet at the park, in the same bank where it all started. The industrialist arrived tense, defensive, but Tesla just said, "Sit down, breathe, and tell me, when was the last time you did this without thinking about anything?" The man tried to respond but couldn't, because he realized he had never done that. It had never simply existed. No agenda, aimless, no competition. And at that moment something in him broke. Not violently, but like ice melting in the sun. He started to cry, shameless, without trying to hide it, just releasing decades of built-up tension. Tesla said nothing. It just stayed there, gift. And when the man finally stopped crying, he whispered, "I built all this, and I still feel empty." "Why?" Tesla responded with the simplicity of someone who had found the truth. "Because you built it from the ego, and the ego is never satisfied. It's like a black hole. The more you feed it, the hungrier it gets. But when you build it from presence, from who you really are, you're already complete before you even begin." The industrialist remained silent for long minutes, and then he asked, "How do I come back? How do I undo 60 years of internal competition?" Tesla smiled. "You don't undo it. You just stop feeding, and over time, the frequency changes on its own." And that's exactly what happened. The man returned to his life, but something had changed. He started delegating, to trust, stop micromanaging every detail, and his business surprisingly prospered even more, because he was no longer operating from the fear of losing. He was operating from the confidence that he had enough. Tesla observed all this from afar, and he realized that his discovery wasn't about changing the world. It was about changing the internal frequency and letting the world naturally reorganize around it. Because the universe does not respond to effort, it responds to resonance. And when you resonate to the frequency of sufficiency, of presence, of peace, everything around you begins to reflect that back. But Tesla knew this was not an immediate universal solution. Not everyone is ready to abandon the competition. Many still need to learn through the pain, the exhaustion of competing with themselves until they can no longer take it. And that's okay. Because each person has their own time, your own journey, your own frequency. Tesla wrote in his last diary, weeks before his death, The greatest gift we can give the world is not an invention. It is living proof that it is possible to exist without competing, without comparing, without ever being enough. Because when one person finds that frequency, it becomes a beacon, and others, lost in the darkness of eternal competition, begin to see the way back home. And he was right. Because even today, more than a century later, the message continues to resonate, not in words, but in living examples, in people who stop, that breathe, who choose presence over performance, and in doing so, they deactivate the competitive ego, not just in themselves, but in everyone around them. The final lesson is simple but devastatingly powerful. The ego that makes you compete even against yourself only has power as long as you believe you need to win to exist. But the truth is that you have already won, for the simple fact of being alive, conscious, gift. Everything else is just noise, wandering frequency, shadow of a competition that was never real. So, if you've made it this far, take a break, take a deep breath, and ask yourself, who am I really competing against? And if the answer is, against myself, know that you can stop, now. Not because he gave up, but because he finally understood that there never was a race. There was just you, trying to reach a version of yourself that is already here. And if this story touched something deep inside you, subscribe to the channel, because what we share here is not entertainment, it's frequency, it's resonance, it's the reminder that you never had to compete to be enough. You always were. The universe does not measure your worth by what you achieve. It recognizes your essence by the frequency you emit. And when this frequency is of peace, of presence, of completeness, you no longer need to prove anything to anyone, not even yourself. Tesla discovered this, lived it, and he left the secret engraved not in formulas or patents, but in his very existence. A lifetime of genius, who only found true peace when he stopped competing. This is the silent revolution, and it starts within you.